This is Notes on Quotes. I'm Stephen Harrison, and the premise of this show is I'm simply talking to really interesting people about a quote that's meaningful to them. People like my guest today, Svend Brinkmann. Svend is a Danish psychology professor, and a few years ago, he became a surprise best-selling author. Like I said, he was living a very academic life, but he wrote this book. It's called Stand Firm, Resisting the Self-Improvement Craze. And it became a bestseller in his home country of Denmark and then throughout Europe. And he was actually very critical of the whole self-help industry within the psychology profession. He suggested that it was having people focus so much on themselves that they were actually ignoring other people. Svend also wrote this book called Standpoints, 10 Old Ideas in a New World. It was after reading that book that I was pretty inspired to reach out to Svend because I was just really curious about what quote this Danish psychology professor would pick for the show. He did not disappoint. If you're the kind of person who enjoys existential philosophy and specifically Kierkegaard, then this episode is the one for you. Hey, before we get started, please subscribe to the Notes on Quotes podcast and please leave us a review. You can follow the show's Instagram at Notes on Quotes, and you can follow me, Stephen Harrison, on Twitter and other social media channels. If you're interested, you can read some of my writing in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Slate. And don't forget, you can read the print versions of all of these interviews at notesonquotes.com. And with that, enjoy the show. Svend, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so what quote are we chatting about today?
Well, I've chosen a quote by Søren Kierkegaard, who was a Dane, and I myself am a Dane. And I guess I'm just going to read the quote. It is very short, but also quite complex. So we need to unpack it, I'm sure. But it goes like this. The self is a relation that relates to itself. Now, this is the short version. It's actually a part of a much longer context. And if you want me to, we can go into that. But in a way, I like to keep the focus on the short form.
Well, I quite like the short version too. You include the long version in your book, Standpoints. And as you mentioned, sometimes Kierkegaard, he has some pretty complex concepts. Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher. For our listeners, can you set up a little bit and tell us a little bit about Kierkegaard?
Yeah, he lived in the mid-19th century, the so-called golden age of Denmark. Another famous Dane from that time was Hans Christian Andersen. And he is considered the grandfather of existentialism. This idea that we are free in our lives and we live with death, finitude as our existential horizon, and we should live in a way authentically and try to take responsibility for our lives. Later existentialists were typically atheists, like Jean-Paul Sartre in France in the 20th century. But Kierkegaard was a Christian thinker, and he developed a very complex philosophy in the sense that he wrote through pseudonyms. So he would take different existential positions on life's issues. So he would develop an aesthetic position, an ethical position, and a religious position, for example. So it's very much up to the reader of Kierkegaard's works to take a stand for oneself, actually, to figure out how am I going to live my life. He never really provides definite answers, but instead poses questions and challenges the reader to think for oneself. And in that sense, he continues, you can say, the philosophical tradition that begins with Socrates in ancient Greece. Socrates never gave answers. He always posed questions, and it was up to the people who talked with Socrates to come up with answers.
I was going to say, I think that's a common characteristic of philosophers, that they ask a lot of questions, and sounds like it's the case with an existential philosopher like Kierkegaard as well.
That's true. I would say, though, that I called him the grandfather of existentialism, but I think that needs to be explained, because he was not an existentialist like Jean-Paul Sartre or Camus or, Jaspers or any of those people, because they saw human beings as completely free. Sartre said famously that existentialism means that existence precedes essence. And this means that there are no essences in our lives, in our humanity, or anything that defines us. The only thing that defines me would be my own free choices. So we are completely free to create ourselves. That's existentialism in a nutshell. And Kierkegaard would not agree with that. He would say, there is much that defines me that I haven't chosen myself. I live in a certain place at a certain time. I'm faced with lots of challenges and demands in my life that I cannot just turn my back on. But what I can choose is how to face reality, so to say. I cannot define myself, but I can choose to choose myself, if you will. And I can do that in a way that other creatures cannot, non-human animals. And the quote, the self is a relation that relates to a self, actually explains that, because other living beings on this planet, plants and non-human animals, they certainly relate to the world. The plant will move in accordance with, how the sun moves on the sky. Animals, of course, seek food or shelter. They have intentions, so they relate to the world. But humans are unique, according to Kierkegaard, because we relate to how we relate to the world. And this gives us freedom. And it's also the cause of despair and anxiety, because we can choose wrongly. That's sort of the price of responsibility and freedom in our lives. But I really like this one-liner, the self is a relation that relates to a self, because it, in a way, it can be used to unpack the whole of Kierkegaard's philosophy, which can say combines this existential understanding of freedom with an emphasis on facticity, on the fact that there actually is a world, there are other people, there are obligations and commitments that just don't choose. They are there before me, so to say.
Sven, you mentioned that a plant or an animal like a dog wouldn't have the same relation to itself as a human would. Would that mean that a plant doesn't have a self in the Kierkegaardian sense?
Yes. According to Kierkegaard, plants don't have selves and non-human animals don't have selves. They lack what he called, in his archaic language, spirit. The whole quote, actually, it's the beginning of his book, The Sickness Unto Death. And he writes in this very complicated way. And interpreters of Kierkegaard believe that he mocks Hegel, another philosopher from that time who wrote a bit before Kierkegaard, who wrote in a very dense and complicated way. So it might be a mockery of Hegel, but Kierkegaard begins by stating man is spirit. And then he asks, but what is spirit? Spirit is the self. But what is the self? And then it comes, the self is a relation which relates itself to its own self. So he would say that what defines us as spiritual creatures is not the fact that we have bodies, that we are physical beings, because stones, plants, and animals are physical beings too. And it's also not simply the fact that we have minds. Dogs have minds, more primitive than humans, I'm sure, but still they do have minds. They feel pain, they look for the bone they buried in the garden and so on. So they have intentions. But what they don't have is the ability to relate to how they relate to the bone, for example. Human beings may, have a desire to eat a bone or something else, but they can say to themselves, well, wait, they can step back, so to say, from their own immediate desires and ask, should I do this? So it's this capacity we have for, not just having desires, not just relating to the world, but having desires about our desires. So this is what normativity is about. And this is actually, in my view, or should be, the fundamentals of human psychology that we find here in Kierkegaard and in this very short quote from him.
Svend, I was thinking before the episode that you quote a lot of philosophers in your work, and I was wondering why you picked this philosopher in particular and why this quote. Is it because Kierkegaard's Danish like you are?
Yeah, I guess that's part of it. I sort of grew up with Kierkegaard when I studied philosophy at university, and he's just part of Danish culture. I have degrees in both philosophy and psychology, and I like Kierkegaard in particular because he, of course, developed his philosophy, but also a theology and also a psychology. I mean, there are books on Kierkegaard's psychology, which is a very complex thing, and I like this broad approach of his to all sorts of existential questions in our lives. And I also like the way that this small quote is like the key to unlock his whole philosophy. I really like it when one is able to boil very elaborated ideas down to simple sentences that you can carry around and activate. So if someone asks me, so how would you explain Søren Kierkegaard's philosophy to me? I would probably begin with this small quote, and then I could perhaps talk for an hour.
Sven, I was a bit surprised because a lot of your writing kind of criticizes the self-help movement. And one of the points that you make is a lot of people have sort of made the self the center of their life or almost a deity in a life. And yet the quote you pick has to deal with the self. Can you talk about how this Kierkegaard definition of the self is different maybe than the modern or contemporary understanding?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You make an important point. It's true that I've been very critical of the way that the idea of the self functions in modern society. We are supposed to realize our inner true selves, be the best version of ourselves, and engage in constant self development. So we talk a lot about the self. One should have self esteem, can put self before almost any positive word, and it becomes even more positive. I see this as a symptom of a narcissistic culture in which we relate in a way to ourselves all the time and are told to do so. So what about Kierkegaard? He also talks about relating to the self. But I think his approach to the self is different. In a way, it's an impersonal self. When he says that the self is a relation that relates to itself, he doesn't talk about my private self. He talks about the common human capacity for self-reflection, which is a good thing. For Kierkegaard, the self is a process. It's, in a way, a conversation one has with oneself. And this process, this reflection, this conversation can only be had because there are other people in the world and in my life who have taught me how to do this. I first relate to other people. As a small child, I don't have a self in the Kierkegaardian sense. I relate to the world. I have needs, but I don't reflect on my needs. I only do that later once I have acquired this capacity for self-reflection, which I do by relating to others. So according to this perspective, the self in Kierkegaard's sense is not a inner private realm of thoughts and emotions. It's a process that enables us to reach outwards to other people, to the world. I think it may function as an important correction to this whole culture of narcissism that we have, where everybody wants to improve on themselves. That's not at all the point when Kierkegaard talks about the self. The point for him is something much more common and shared among human beings, and I think we need to hear this message today.
Do you think that this Kierkegaard idea of the self as a process or a shared conversation do you think that would make people happier than sort of the contemporary or maybe more narcissistic interpretation of the self?
Yeah, I think the sad story of today is that whenever people are unhappy, they are told that they just need to be themselves. And we don't know what it means to be oneself, I think. In my view, it would be much better to tell people just to be human in a way, just to aim for what is shared among us. It's actually quite difficult to be oneself. If you're going to do a job interview, or if you're going to perform at an examination or something like that, and you're a bit nervous, then your parents or your friends, they'll tell you, it'll be all right, just be yourself. And that's actually the most difficult thing you can do. So I don't think happiness is found within, some mysterious realm of an inner private self. I think happiness is found by connecting with the world, connecting with other people, doing meaningful things. And Kierkegaard's conception of the self as a shared conversation might enable us to realize that. Of course, I am interpreting Kierkegaard here because when he wrote this in the first half of the 19th century, he wrote in a deeply religious culture. That was the context. And Kierkegaard definitely believed in God. And he thought that this self as a spirit, as something that relates to itself, is such a magical thing almost, that it can only be put there in the world by God. As a secular psychologist who also does empirical research, I don't follow Kierkegaard when he said that the self is created by God. I say that it's probably more likely that the self is formed in interpersonal relationship. As I said before, the newborn child doesn't have a self in this sense, but it develops this reflective self when others relate to the child, and the child begins to relate to itself through the ways that others relate to the child, you see. So this is how self-reflection emerges in our lives. Individuality, the individual reflective self, is a secondary product that comes after the way we relate socially to and with others. First, we have, if you will, interpersonal conversations. And secondly, we can internalize that and form a self of our own. This, I believe, is immensely important today in an individualist culture where, people think of themselves as little gods who can choose and who can create and who can, like happiness is a choice. These words and sentences are quoted all the time. If we understand that we are utterly dependent on others and the self is only there because of others, and we owe everything in our lives to the relationships that enable us to be selves, I think this will give us a whole other outlook on the world that is both truer to how things are, but also something that may give us a deeper sense of happiness, of belonging to the world.
Kierkegaard was obviously very religious. He wrote a lot about this idea of the leap of faith and an individual relationship with God. But what I'm hearing you say, Svend, is that maybe as a secular reader, you're kind of replacing, instead of talking about God, you're thinking about the role that the community or social relationships play in the development of the self. Is that right? That it's more of the role of culture now?
Yes. When Kierkegaard writes about God, I will read that as, for a modern secular reader such as myself, meaning community or society or the social. Of course, Kierkegaard would object to that reading. He would say, no, I actually literally do mean God, the creator. So I'm aware that I am, in a way, misinterpreting him. I sometimes discuss with true philosophers, true experts on Kierkegaard, and they attack me, if you will, and say this is not how he should be approached. And I totally agree. I mean, if you want to understand what Kierkegaard meant, you have to read him as a fundamentalist Christian, because that's how he was. But I think it's fair enough to state that. Yes, we know that he was a fundamentalist Christian. He believed that the whole world and the self was created by God. But still say, if we want to make sense of his existential ideas in a secular world informed by science, we can say that the self, for example, and the commitments and obligations that we meet in our lives arise from human social life. And this is also in accordance with much social psychology, sociology. One of the founders of the discipline of sociology, Durkheim, a Frenchman, would say something similar. In the US, I'm much inspired by pragmatist sociologists and social psychologists like John Dewey, George Herbert Mead, and they would definitely understand this self-reflection as immensely important for human beings, and they would see it as arising from the ways that we relate to each other in human communities.
It sounds like in some ways you love the quote, but you don't agree with Kierkegaard on everything. You wouldn't be the first guest who doesn't entirely agree with the author of the quote.
No, it's impossible to agree with everything in Kierkegaard, because when you read his exposition of the aesthetic way of life, when you read about the seducer who lives in order to, attain pleasure, you might say, this is true. This is what life is about, living with as much pleasure as possible. But then you cannot agree with the way he emphasizes the ethical life. And you cannot agree with the way he talks about religion and belief, religious faith. So, not even Kierkegaard agreed with everything he said. And I think this is his true genius, that he doesn't provide definite answers, but he shows us a variety of existential positions. And then it's up to the reader to work through this and use it almost therapeutically in one's own life. And there are parts of Kierkegaard that I simply think are outrageous. For example, when he talks in Fear and Trembling, another one of his very famous works, about the biblical story of Abraham, who is told by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. And Kierkegaard interprets him as a knight of faith because he is willing to kill his own child because God tells him to. For Kierkegaard, this is proof that there is, and this is how he puts it himself, a teleological suspension of the ethical. That means, in more common terms, that we sometimes have to sacrifice ethical principles for a higher cause. And a higher cause in this way can only come from God. I think this is outrageous. This is religious fundamentalism at its worst. If I heard a voice, or if I read in a book, or if my, religious authority told me to kill someone, my own child or anybody, I hope that I would be able to say no, because this conflicts with, universal ethical principles. So I don't think we should suspend the ethical for a higher cause, no matter what it is. And actually, Kierkegaard on this point is not that different from, in theory, I don't think he would do that in practice, but in theory, he's not that different from today's religious fundamentalists, which sadly the world is full of.
Svend, you're a professor of psychology, but as you mentioned, you have degrees in both psychology and philosophy. Do you think that we need to incorporate more concepts from philosophy into modern psychology?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, for me, essential. We have, as I see it, a psychologized culture. We use psychology for so many purposes in schools, in workplaces, in our private lives. We think psychologically about ourselves and the world. And of course, psychology is a legitimate science. It does provide certain tools with which we can improve ourselves and, live better lives and possibly attain some level of happiness. But the problem with psychology, just as any other science, is that it easily forgets values, the ethical, the whole normative realm. And we need philosophers and philosophy to remind us of that and to, find the limits of psychology. There are so many questions that psychology cannot answer. But these questions about existence, about ethics, about aesthetics, about politics, and so on, are still very important. Possibly even the most important ones in our lives. And I fear that psychology has become it has colonized our self-understanding. It has taught us to think of ourselves as creatures with these inner selves that we should realize or optimize. And I think this is a very questionable image of human beings. And I think we need the philosophical critique of that. Philosophy has rarely provided answers. We have sciences to give us answers, but we need philosophy to raise questions, including questions to all the answers that come from science, in particular, such a powerful and influential science as psychology. Psychology is a young science. It only began in the late 19th century as an empirical investigation of how the mind works. But since then, it has just, grown enormously and really influenced how we think about the world in good ways and in bad. And I'm really skeptical about the way that ethics and politics and so on have been psychologized.
You mentioned that psychology is a young science, and I heard you use the word optimize, and that made me think of something I've been reading about a lot lately, which is this idea of the quantified self. The idea is that a person can use biostatistics and fitness trackers and things like that to collect all sorts of data about themselves. How do you think this quantified self is different maybe than the version of the self that is expressed in this quote?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very nice example when you talk about the quantified self as as the almost the exact opposite of what Kierkegaard is talking about, because the quantified self obviously is a self that is quantifiable. We can measure ourselves with the aim of optimizing ourselves. But Kierkegaard's self, as the relation that relates to itself, is not a self of quantitative measures. It's a self of qualitative distinctions. It's a self that is trying to attain some level of moral complexity and political commitments and so on. And it's a self that doesn't just ask, so how can I quantitatively improve my score? But it asks, is it even relevant? Is it even worthwhile looking at myself in terms of this quantitative score? So it's not, for the Kierkegaardian self, it's not the strength in quantitative terms of a desire that matters, for example. It's the qualitative worth of having that desire. So I may have a huge ambition. I believe I might be really happy if I am able to, reach my goal, and I can measure how far I am from attaining that goal. That's the quantified approach to the self. But to pose the question, is this goal worth having? I mean, it's true, you might have it. You might try to reach for it. But what if it is irrelevant to a good human life? Buying a sports car, or running a marathon in less than 3 hours, whatever it might be. If you live your life based on those goals that you try to quantify, then you might be missing out on what is truly important in a qualitative sense. And I fear that we focus so much on what is quantifiable that we try to optimize in our lives, because we have forgotten the whole qualitative dimension of the self and of what is valuable in our lives.
But just to push on that a little bit, as a person, you do have, or you are faced with kind of quantitative goals, something like you need to exercise 3 times a week or eat so many calories or fewer than this many calories. How do you balance the fact that some things in life are quantified or that you have to hit certain metrics or targets, for example, in your professional life, with kind of this Kierkegaardian idea that the self is a relation and a conversation and being more self-reflective?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I like the way you ask the question, because you ask me to talk about finding the balance. And I think balance is the key word, because I don't think Kierkegaard would say that we should, eradicate any of these dimensions. It's perfectly legitimate to have certain goals and certain metrics that enables you to look at, for how far are you from reaching those goals. But if that's all you have, just the metrics and the quantifiable stuff, then you miss out on so much that is truly important. All the qualitative distinction, the whole moral dimension of our lives. And on the other hand, if you only have that, I mean, you would have to be some kind of moral saint that very, very few of us, if any, can ever become. And in Kierkegaard's famous book on either or, there is a long letter in that book written by Judge Wilhelm, which is one of Kierkegaard's pseudonyms. And the letter is from the ethical perspective, represented by Wilhelm, written to the young person A. He's simply just called A, who represents the aesthetic dimension in life. And the letter, I don't know if I can translate it into English, but the title of the letter would be something like, "On the balance between the aesthetic and the ethical in the development of personality." And so the balance is important. We cannot only be ethical. That's a life with very little enjoyment, a life where we sort of erase all human aspirations for sports cars and marathons. But we shouldn't also not just be aesthetic, just pursue our interests, just try to optimize the subjective version of ourselves. We should strike a balance. And in order to strike a balance, one needs to understand that both dimensions exist, that they're both there. And I think this is something we can really learn from Kierkegaard. Understanding the complexity of life, understanding that there is an aesthetic dimension, an ethical dimension, perhaps a religious dimension. And living a life is all about integrating these, balancing between these dimensions as we go along. When I read the self-help books, when I read much of psychology, I have to say that most of it is about the aesthetic. It's about how to realize yourself. It's not about becoming a human self in a more shared sense, which is the ethical. Because the ethical for Kierkegaard is the shared, the common, the general. And the aesthetic is the particular, that which only pertains to you as a unique individual. And so much in modern life is about you as a unique individual. And of course, that is okay. I mean, you are a unique individual, but perhaps there are also general ethical demands and obligations that we need to take into account as we live our lives. And yes, again, I think this is, Kierkegaard's genius, to be able to see all these various spheres or aspects of existence and developing them in almost pure forms in his various works. And then as a reader, we should remember to read all the works in order to understand, the whole range of dimensions that are characteristic of a human life.
Subject to the fact that life is finite and we have a certain quantified amount of time to,
yeah,
of course, but there's always time to read Kierkegaard. Yeah. Reading from your book here, Standpoints, Sven, you had this line. You said, "The self in the Kierkegaardian sense is not a thing, nor should it be made into a tool or commodity. The self is not a resource to be optimized or to be monetized by human resource managers. We cannot put a value on the self. It has dignity, but not a value." Sven, could you give some examples of how society has instrumentalized the self or made it into a commodity?
Yeah. In modern work life, for example, we do not just give away our time as a resource in exchange for a salary. We increasingly give away ourselves. We become commodities. We sell our emotional, personal, social competencies, and not only our more immediate skills. So this is an example of, and I mean, we don't need to draw on Karl Marx and his ideas about how capitalism commodifies everything, including the human being, which leads to alienation, according to Marx. But it is actually quite obvious in modern society that that sort of thing happens all the time. And it's not just dubious. I mean, it's of course fair that and also quite good in a way that modern workplaces are populated by whole persons. I mean, not just people who have an instrumental relationship to their jobs. But I think it's dangerous if you give away all of yourself, if you will, to the workplace. If, for example, in Denmark at least, we have many employers who engage in coaching of their employees. They want to optimize their employees' personalities and personal competencies. One is asked to continually develop as a whole person and so on. And it sounds very good, but I'm not sure that it should be happening in the context of work where there is this intrinsically instrumental relationship between the employer and the employee. So if one has one of Kierkegaard's books in one's hand when one goes to see the boss, for example, I believe it's called a performance and development review, where you sit down and talk with your boss about where you see yourself in 3 years' time from now or something like that, you can say, well, let's talk about what is truly important and not just about how I can optimize my personal competencies in order to produce more. Kierkegaard would object to the very term human resource management because, as you said in the quote from my book, human beings are not resources. They are ends in themselves. And resources are stuff that we use. Their value is tied to use value. But human beings have values, have intrinsic value. We have dignity. We should not be treated simply as resources or tools for certain purposes.
This idea of humans having intrinsic value and some of the ideas connected to this quote reminds me of the idea from Kant that you also mentioned, that humans are ends and not means, and that they belong to the kingdom of ends. Do you see some sort of connection there with Kant?
Absolutely. I mentioned before that Kierkegaard wrote about the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious dimensions in life. And his works on ethics derive in large parts from the work of Immanuel Kant, this great Enlightenment philosopher from Germany, who I wouldn't say discovered, because other philosophers had known this before Kant, but he definitely emphasized to a greater extent than anyone else before him that humans have intrinsic value, that the word for that is dignity, and therefore humans should never be treated solely as a means, but always we are ends in ourselves. It's okay to have an instrumental relationship to other people, obviously. I mean, society couldn't function if we didn't, from time to time, use each other as tools. When I go and shop, I buy my groceries, I, in a way, consider the person in the shop as an instrument that I use in order to get my stuff. And vice versa. For the person working in the shop, I am more or less an instrument that enables the person in the shop to get a salary, and that's fine. But Kant and Kierkegaard would agree, I'm sure, would insist that we are never allowed only to treat each other as means. And this shows itself if the shop person, for example, has a heart attack, and I'm standing there with my 2 liters of milk and bread, and I say, "Give me another one. This one is broke. I need a new tool." I mean, that would be absurd. If the shop person is having a heart attack, I am immediately aware that this person is an end in itself. I should do everything I can to save that person's life. It doesn't matter if I get my milk or not. The ethical is so visible all of a sudden, as it should be. And the situation is very different if I work with a real tool like a hammer, and the hammer breaks down. I cannot, put the nail in the piece of wood or whatever I'm doing, and then I'll look for a new hammer. I mean, I don't have an ethical relationship to the hammer. It doesn't have intrinsic value. It doesn't have dignity. It only has instrumental value. But human beings have intrinsic value. I think we need to stress this more deeply than we have had to do at least in my life before. I mean, it has always, for me, been obvious, and we have built societal institutions. We have had, human rights in the UN and so on. There's been an agreement that humans have this kind of dignity. But now it seems, sadly, that things are going in the other direction. In Europe, we discuss, well, these human rights, they're a bit unpractical because we have refugees coming from the Middle East. Do we really need to keep these human rights in mind? So, and I'm terrified by the fact that we are moving backwards, ethically speaking, for the first time in my life. And I think we definitely need to go back to Kant and also Kierkegaard in order to emphasize the inherent value of any human life.
This idea of the inherent value of a human life, or the intrinsic value, as opposed to a financial or quantifiable value of a human life, has me thinking a little bit about social media. And one of the guests that I had on the show was a growth hacker who's helped people develop their online platforms on websites like Facebook and Instagram. And he talked a lot about how the costs per acquisition of a follower in the United States or a country in Western Europe is much higher than in India or Indonesia, where maybe it only costs a penny per follower. And that, just putting a price on a follower like that, had me thinking about some of the ideas you mentioned about putting dollar amounts or having a more transactional dimension to human connection, which is all a long way to say, Sven, do you think that this issue that you're talking about of human life sort of being valued in a quantifiable way rather than an intrinsic way, and maybe a change that's taking place over time, is that related at all to changes in technology?
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it's much easier to understand and respect the intrinsic value of any human life when you're standing right in front of someone. There is the biblical story of, what's it called, the merciful Samaritan? Is that how you say it in English? Who meets a complete stranger,
say the Good Samaritan,
who is in need and knows that I should help this other person. And that's because they are, faced with the other person who is in distress. And technology, increasingly mediates our relationship to other people, takes us further and further away, which means that we can interact with a huge number of people whom we don't know, whom we'll never meet. We don't know if they are in distress or not, and it doesn't matter at all. And I mean, that's okay. I'm not against technology. I'm not against social media. But I think there is a dimension of actual human encounters where we stand in front of other people in flesh and blood, where we sense their feelings, how they're doing. That is indispensable. I mean, we need this as part of our lives. If not, I think we will increasingly come to think of other people in terms of their instrumental value. We will pose questions like, so you have value to the extent that I can get something from you, that I can gain something from knowing you or interacting with you. We used to have friends. On Facebook, it was also called friends. When do we activate our relations on LinkedIn? Well, when we need to get a new job or get something done, or, so other people have instrumental value on these social media. And just to repeat Kant once more, we should never treat other human beings only as means, but also always as ends in themselves. And we are not encouraged to do that by social media, I'm afraid.
Sven, you mentioned that you were concerned that for the first time in your life, this idea of human rights was maybe fading, especially
Hmm.
as has been established or formulated in Europe. What kind of solution do you think there is to that issue? Is it something like people should read more philosophers like Kierkegaard, or should they read more books by Svend Brinkmann? What do you think is the solution there?
I don't think books will solve a problem. It would be nice if they could. I don't think people suddenly become empathetic by reading books. I think people develop a shared sense of humanity by interacting with other people, by meeting other people. It's no coincidence that NGOs who want to raise money for their causes never only show statistics about, the extent of the problem. They always also show images of concrete people, often children, because it's much easier to say, okay, this child is in need. I definitely should support this cause. So, I mean, the more we, well, and this is in another way a problem because we also have a climate crisis, so we shouldn't actually travel that much. But the more we travel, the more we meet other people who are different from ourselves and learn to appreciate that they're also humans. The more we are able to see a common humanity in all of us, the more solidarity we will have with also those who are far away. I know, I mean, in a way it's utopian, and we usually say this in Denmark, such a small country, we are less than 6 million people. We cannot save the whole world. Of course we cannot, but collectively, with UN and all the great nations contributing, we can actually do a lot. We could, if we wanted, eliminate extreme poverty in the world, for example. We could help refugees to a greater extent than we do now. It's not rocket science, but as long as people just show up as numbers, this is another problem of quantification. People just become numbers, and why should we help numbers? And we shouldn't. We should help real individuals, but we first need to see them as such.
The quote again is: "The self is a relation that relates to itself." Sven, I was wondering about this word relation and how that word was translated from the original by Kierkegaard.
Yes, in Danish, we actually do have a word, relation, which is equivalent, of course, to relation. But that's not the word that Kierkegaard was using. The word in Danish is forhold. So the self is a forhold that forholder sig to itself. And I think that adds an important dimension to what he's trying to say, because relation is a neutral concept. We can talk about a relation between apples and pears, a relation between A and B, a relation between, all sorts of things. It's just a neutral connection between things or objects or events or something. But the term forhold in Danish, which is not easy to translate, denotes something more active. It's more like a task. You have to relate to yourself. And so I think this is important for Kierkegaard when he is trying to say that being a self is not simply something that happens. It's a process, yes, but it's a process in which you are actively engaged as a self. It's a task, it's a job, something that is demanded of you. And I think this is lost actually in the translation when we just see it as a relation. It's not a passive relation, it's an active way of forming a relationship, you could say, to the relation itself.
Sven, you mentioned that books won't solve all of the world's problems, but I have personally wondered, as someone who'd like to know a little bit more about Kierkegaard and maybe read some of Kierkegaard's works, if you had a recommendation on a primer or a short introduction to Kierkegaard, maybe for me and our listeners.
I must admit that I have mainly read Kierkegaard's original works, and I would actually recommend doing that. They're not as difficult as people think. He doesn't, well, in some of the works, he writes in rather technical philosophical language. such as the sickness unto death, where the quote is taken from. That is quite difficult. But I would recommend either or. It's, I'm sure, in a wonderful English translation, it's quite easy to read. It has two parts. First, you are presented with the aesthetic outlook on life, and then you're presented with the ethical outlook on life. And then the job you have as a reader is to balance the two, I think. I don't think Kierkegaard wanted to say that one is right and the other is wrong. I think he wanted us to understand that life is both about doing well, that's the ethical, living right, and also about feeling good, which is what the aesthetic is about.
This theme of balance seems to have come up quite a few times in our conversation, and I'm glad for that. Sven, thank you so much for coming on the show. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Notes on Quotes. Again, I'm Stephen Harrison, and this series is a team effort with audio production by Jason Cady. Our transcriptions are done by Sarah Baum of Sharp Copy Transcription. Our theme song is Water and Bridges by Joshua Heffernan. And our podcast cover art was done by Jacqueline Parsons. Check out our website, notesonquotes.com, where you can get the print versions of all of these interviews. Subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you choose, and please leave us a review. And don't forget to follow us on social media and Instagram, where our handle is Notes on Quotes. Thanks again.